We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Also, any of those people that are
Acaba de empezar la reunión.
that would like to listen in Spanish, Isidra, could you please give them the information?
Of course. Yes, buenos días a todos. La reunión de hoy va a tener servicios de interpretación simultánea en español. Para acceder a los servicios de interpretación, en breves momentos ustedes van a ver en la parte de abajo de su pantalla un icono del globo terráqueo. Van a poder hacer clic en ese icono y escoger el idioma español o Spanish. Gracias. Are you going to start the interpretation services now?
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you'll join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Josh, could you do the roll call for us this morning?
Yes, sir. Rachel Arizmendi. Don Cameron.
Here.
Janae DaCosta. Mike Gallo. Here. Eric Holst. Glenda Humison. Here. Julia Jackson. Here. Bryce Lundberg. Yes. David Mancera. Michelle Passero. Here. Doria Robinson. Here. Frank Salazar. Joy Sterling. Yes. Patricia Stock. Here. Chris Valadez. Mr. President, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Josh. At this time, we need to approve the minutes of May 3rd. You've all received them via email. Do we have a motion to approve? Second. Thank you both. Do we have any discussion or corrections? Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? So moved. Thank you. One abstention. Thank you. Well, today we have the...
I'm sorry, excuse me, sorry to interrupt, but are you gonna start the interpretation services in Spanish for Zoom? The channel is not established yet.
They don't have the connection established?
Hey, Isidra, I'll work on that right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, why don't we wait just a minute, see if we get this. All right. Well, like I said, welcome everybody. Good to see you. Good to have everyone here today. We have with us today two members of the California Water Commission. We have with us Matthew Swanson and Kimberly Gallagher, and also Joe Yoon, who is the executive director. So welcome. It's been a pleasure. Good to have you with us today, and we look forward to the conversation later in the meeting. But great to have you with us. Let's see. If you'd like to introduce yourselves and give a little background, I'll do that later, but you're more than welcome to say a few words now if you like.
Well, I just want to say thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. We're very excited about projects that we're working on. We're working very diligently on getting some water storage projects through the process. And I look forward to a very stimulating conversation around what we can do here. What's going on?
Very good.
I'll just echo those comments and say, yeah, I think this is a great time for us to be here. I'm also a farmer in my day job, so I appreciate the invite for being able to attend.
No, great to have both of you here, and your director as well.
Yes.
So at this time, Secretary Ross, would you like to give us the departmental update? I know it's been busy.
It has been busy, but I don't want to go on and on like I did last time when I gave a tutorial of what do we do at the Department of Food and Agriculture. There are a few highlights. Obviously, since our last meeting, we had the May revise, which had significant new investment. Well, one time, I want to make that very clear, one time to my friends in finance, one time spending, as the state focuses on really building climate resiliency. And obviously, water security is a piece of that. But also really looking at the safety nets that have been very strained, considerable funding for and ongoing funding for universal school lunch, which is really amazing to be a leader in that space, and some additional funding for the kitchen infrastructure and the workforce development aspects of that, really thinking about everything we do and what that means, especially in a green economy, the workforce development skills that are going to be necessary, and that we're all collaborating across agencies. So we've had several meetings. I know you all enjoyed the visit last month from Secretary Palucci. We've had several ongoing meetings with her about workforce development. She has a keen interest in the food and ag jobs of the future. So I see a really strong role for us in partnership there. We have spent a lot of time this month, and I don't want to dish ahead of all of our excellent speakers on water and drought, but spending increasing amounts of time on that. And this time around, spending a lot of time starting in the last few weeks on Imperial County and what's happening with the Colorado River water. It is an area that is so far removed from where we tend to dwell during drought. This drought is highly unusual because it's not so Central Valley focused. It is a Sac Valley focus in ways that we have not seen before. And what we may be facing with the Colorado River Basin and those states is like, I spent the whole weekend on tutorials just trying to figure it out. It's frightening. I'll just leave it at that. So thank you for the future. It came at us fast with the higher temperatures and what it's doing to dry soil conditions. We had the pleasure this month of gathering our Farm to School Advisory Committee with the first partner at the Governor's Mansion to really celebrate the rollout of that terrific roadmap. That's been very fun to do that, and we've had some follow-up meetings with legislators. I spent a day in Sonoma County in the early part of May doing a tour on nature-based solutions at Stumple Creek Ranch, and later that day, Secretary Crowfoot and I did a joint presentation to the first ever Sonoma County Water Summit. They did 2 full days on everything from water rights to SGMA and everything in between. It was really, really well done. Had the occasion this month to speak to the annual meeting of the California Association of Food Banks. Great partnership there. I followed that with a tour. Finally did a tour that's been rescheduled for 2 years of the San Francisco wholesale produce market. I would love for the state board to go there. What they have done with that place in this very urban center, it is a food hub. And one of the reasons they've been able to reinvest in the development and help incubate some new businesses is because when Governor Newsom was Mayor Newsom, they went to him to see if they wanted to have the produce market there. He and then Secretary Kawamura hosted an urban ag roundtable, and the city provided a 60-year lease, which gives them the certainty. They do amazing things there, and I wanted to bite of everything that we walked by. I mean, just beautiful produce, and to be able to see that and the passion that they have that, and the new partnerships they've established with nonprofits to really address food security with good, healthy, California-grown food in every neighborhood that they serve. It's tremendous. And so I think it would be a very inspiring place for us all to go visit. On that same vein, last week I participated in a press conference on shredding hunger, which is, you'll be happy about this, Mr. Gallo, which is what dairy families have contributed under California Real Milk, 190,000 pounds of shredded cheddar cheese product that can really go a long way. It was very fun to do that. The partners there were the California Association of Food Banks and Feeding America. So it's been a good month to really get out and do some good work there. Just wanted to touch on a couple of other things. The fourth in our series of Ag Tech workshops that I've done in partnership with Western Growers. It was held at Woodland Community College. Dean Stark, it was really great to have you there. It was really fun to have you in the audience and to hear some of your professors talk and the passion they have to really help our young people understand the tremendous opportunities in agriculture and around tech and innovation. I know that's of particular interest to you, Mr. Swanson. So it's been good to do that and really good content. I hope you found it worthwhile. I certainly did. It's very fun. And then closed out last week with a visit to Sun World Innovation Center. This is going to be an international research and development center in Wasco, California. And it is pretty incredible what they're doing there. Sun World has always focused on fruits primarily. They've always been really focused on improving the genetics for the growers to be more successful and use less inputs and be tolerant to pests, tolerant to climate and temperature, tolerant to drought, tolerant to everything, but exceedingly flavorful and nutritious for the consumer experience. So very fun to see that. I know that I think Driscoll's and Sun World over the years have had some collaborations, and they're both doing really remarkable things to make sure that we can meet the nutrition needs of our population. So I'll stop at that. We still have pests. I just want you to know that. We have some really good scientists doing some great work in that regard, but nothing too earth-shattering on that front this month.
That's good.
That is good. Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Secretary. We're going to spend a lot of time on water today, and so we're going to begin by having Deputy Secretary Nancy Vogel via Zoom discussing drought update and the May revise. Nancy is the Deputy Secretary for Water at the California Natural Resources Agency. In this position, Nancy coordinates implementation of the administration's water resilience portfolio and assists with other water policy priorities. So, Nancy, welcome. Good to have you with us again, and it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, board members and commissioners. I'm sorry I'm a disembodied giant head above you and not with you. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm gonna count on Josh to flag it if I'm not coming through okay. So I want to give you a pretty quick rundown of current drought conditions, drought response, and tick through some of the things that were in the governor's May revision to his proposed budget, because I think that will give you a good sense of how we're trying to deal with the drought in the immediate while we also build long-term water resilience. You may recall that this winter precipitation swung like a chimpanzee. We had record-breaking amounts of precipitation in October and in December, and then from January through mid-April, nothing. It broke records for dryness. So we count on a small number of big storms every year to fill our reservoirs and our aquifers and build our snowpack, and we only got probably about a third or a half of the number of storms that we really needed. So officially, we are in a third year of drought, as you well know. Right now, storage in our biggest reservoir, Shasta, is at about 48% of average for this time of year. Oroville, our second biggest reservoir, is at 69% of average. Sierra Snowpack's about 7% statewide of average for this time of year after it ping-ponged around this winter and reached about more than 200% of average in some places for a brief period of time. The modest storms that we got in April delayed fire season a bit to the relief of CAL FIRE, and it did boost reservoirs a little, but not enough to compensate for that incredibly dry January through April. And it's not enough to reverse the supply cutbacks that the state's two biggest water projects announced. That's the Redding to Bakersfield Central Valley project and the Oroville to San Diego State Water project. The State Water Project, which delivers drinking water to 2 out of every 3 Californians, finalized its allocation last week at just 5%, and any unmet critical health and safety needs for the 29 public water agencies that it supplies. One of the many firsts experienced in this drought is that for the first time in its 60-year history, the Central Valley Project announced that it will deliver only supplies sufficient to meet health and safety needs to its municipal customers, and that includes the cities of Fresno and Redding. Most CVP agricultural water service contractors will receive a 0% allocation. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, which operates the Central Valley Project, aims to conserve as much storage as it can behind Shasta Dam right now, and it's going to rely on Folsom Lake to help meet Delta water quality standards this summer. For its part, the State Water Project, which is operated by our California Department of Water Resources, intends to prioritize its Lake Oroville releases to maintain Delta water quality, to protect endangered species, and to meet its obligations to senior water right holders. The rock barrier, the emergency temporary rock barrier that the Department of Water Resources installed across West Falls River has been reestablished. That's in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. It's been reestablished and it's going to stay there until probably the end of November to help physically repel salinity in the Delta, so that we don't have to release so much water from upstream reservoirs to repel the salt this summer and fall. The Water Board right now is providing emergency water supplies to 8 communities and closely watching another 35 that are at risk of experiencing outages in the next 90 days or so. Every week, we're seeing about roughly 90 new dry wells reported voluntarily to the state, and about half of those I've noticed lately are in Fresno County, but we are seeing dry wells reported in new places in this drought in the Sacramento Valley, like Tehama and Butte and Glenn counties, and we didn't see that to the same extent in the last drought. There is no way around a very dicey year for endangered winter-run Chinook salmon that once historically spawned well above what is Shasta Dam into the cooler McCloud and Pitt rivers. Right now, the fish are blocked by Shasta Dam and spawn in the river near Redding. The Water Board has approved a temperature management plan for Shasta Reservoir that attempts to preserve enough deep, cold water in the lake to keep alive some of the winter-run eggs and fry, and to also sustain a federal hatchery. The Central Valley Project allocations are so low that even senior water right holders in the Sac Valley, who typically are insulated from drought, are getting cut back. And we're seeing extensive fallowing that costs jobs and small town income, and it affects the Pacific Flyway that waterfowl, migratory waterfowl, and shorebirds depend upon. And I know you'll discuss that in greater depth later this morning. The governor and the legislature last summer enacted a historic 3-year, $5.2 billion package of investments in water, including for drought relief. And since then, the Department of Water Resources has distributed hundreds of millions of dollars to small communities and urban water districts for projects that include replacing leaky pipes, installing water storage tanks, refurbishing wells, and other things, interties, for example, that will help stave off supply disruptions and hopefully help us get through the next drought in better shape. The governor in July asked all Californians to voluntarily conserve at least 15% of water compared to 2020. At times and in some places, we have hit that target, but statewide, collectively, in February, we saved only 0.5%. In March, consumption jumped nearly 19% compared to March 2020. In the last drought, to the chagrin of urban water suppliers, Governor Brown had imposed a 25% mandatory cutback. And in this drought, Governor Newsom has given local water districts the opportunity to lead on water conservation. But that may change if we don't see significant savings soon. Last month, the Water Board enacted emergency regulations banning irrigation of ornamental turf. That's the grass around business parks and in median strips that nobody walks on except when they're mowing it. Those regulations should take effect later this month, and we hope that they can make a quick difference, given that about 50% of urban water use goes to landscaping. we'd like to see in this drought that irrigation concentrated on trees and not on turf. The Water Board also enacted emergency regulations that require all urban water suppliers to implement conservation actions under a level 2 of their water shortage contingency plans. And that's a level meant to address up to a 20% water shortage in supply due to extreme weather. Those actions under level 2 often include things such as limiting outdoor water use by day and by hour and enforcing water use prohibitions. If you did not see the extreme drought warnings on the Caltrans message boards on freeways over the Memorial Day weekend, you should see them again later this month, and hopefully you're coming across Save Our Water messaging in your day-to-day life. The governors may revise his adjustments to his proposed budget from January, include $100 million for a vigorous statewide Save Our Water public education campaign to help reinforce whatever it is that local water districts are doing. I hope I don't bore you with this. I'll try to be quick, but I do want to tick through the other proposed investments in the governor's $2 billion May revised water package. And please keep in mind, again, that these investments would come on top of the $5.2 billion package that was enacted last summer and fall. And these proposed investments, must be negotiated in the next few weeks with legislative leaders. I sound worse than I feel. I'm sorry. The governor proposes an additional $100 million for groundwater cleanup and water recycling projects, $400 million to augment the state revolving funds for drinking water and wastewater projects, $10 million to further advance forecast-informed reservoir operations, which can help dam owners decide when they really need to release water, and when they should hold it back for drier days. $6.75 million to improve our forecasts of how much runoff we think the snowpack will give to our reservoirs, because right now, in an increasingly warm world, our historical patterns cannot be used. They're just obsolete. $180 million to continue DWR's grant program to help small communities and urban water districts with drought relief. $25 million to continue the Water Board's emergency drinking water response with bottled water and storage tanks. $27 million to install and remove the rock barriers in the delta that physically block the salt water. $8 million for enforcement of water right curtailments. $44 million to continue the Water Board's badly needed effort to improve the data infrastructure behind the water right system. $21 million to purchase and pre-position 1,000 plastic storage tanks in communities where we think we may see wells going dry later this summer. $20 million to lay the groundwork for multi-year transfers to meet community or environmental needs, as extreme hydrology and the cutbacks in the water project allocations have pretty much disrupted the traditional water transfer market. $60 million to continue a grant program to help regions plan for land use changes that reduce groundwater pumping and take pressure off of aquifers. Last month, for example, the Department of Conservation issued $40 million in grants for this same purpose, including $10 million to Madera County to pay farmers to repurpose marginal farmlands in critically overdrafted basins. $15 million to develop an inventory of active water wells in the counties at highest drought risk of domestic well disruption. This is important because it'll help counties plan. Right now, the existing state well information we've got makes drought response difficult because it includes wells that are no longer in use, and it's also missing some wells. $50 million to reduce farm irrigation in areas of high risk of dry wells or subsidence, and to conserve at least 300,000 acre feet of water. This program would promote transition from permanent crops to annual crops. $10 million to reduce water consumption by farmers in the Delta to increase Delta outflow. And this would help us learn a lot more about water conservation in the Delta through monitoring, because the Delta, as you know, is different geologically, hydrologically than any other place in the state. $23 million for emergency food boxes for farm workers and others who lose employment when crops are not planted. $20 million for direct assistance to small operation farmers and ranchers facing big increases in their water costs. $40 million to continue the grant program at CDFA that incentivizes farmers to install efficient irrigation systems, that's SWEEP. $26 million to support SIGMA implementation. $20 million of that would go for grants. The other $6 million would be for technical assistance to help the groundwater sustainability agencies. And then $26 million to the Department of Conservation for a grant program that would allow us to improve the water use efficiency of our own state facilities. There's also a $71 million drought contingency fund, in the governor's proposal. And I'm just going to tick through a couple of the investments in the governor's budget that would help fish and wildlife. $100 million to protect salmon, $122 million for aquatic habitat restoration and projects that enable water right holders to make water available for environmental purposes. And this would support the voluntary agreements that the administration reached a few weeks ago with water users on the Sacramento River and its tributaries. There's also $17 million proposed to help us chart a new future for the state's hatcheries because they depend upon a dwindling stock of cold water. $10 million for landowner incentives to flood up lands for migratory waterfowl. Last year, a $5 million investment like this helped to create more than 50,000 acres of habitat. And then finally, the governor proposed investing $500 million in the 25-26 fiscal year to support the projects that the Water Commission and Joe have been working so hard on to advance. And those are the 7 water storage projects that are eligible for Proposition 1 funding. If they are completed, all of them combined, that would boost the state's storage capacity by 2.77 million acre feet. So this drought, to me at least, feels different than the last drought. And I think that is because as average temperatures increase, plants and soil and the atmosphere itself are just consuming more water. The effect is real. Call it aridification. I mean, it's here and we feel it now. And regardless of California's natural fluctuation between drought and flood, we will always have less water to use than we would have had in cooler times. We need to adjust. So we need to develop new water supplies. We got to store more water when it arrives. We have to use what we've got more efficiently. We've got to improve all of our water management actions with better forecasting and data and administration of water rights. And the governor's proposed budget would help us do all of that. And it's under negotiation right now with the with legislative leaders. And hopefully we'll have some results in a week or so. I'll stop right there and hopefully we'll be able to have Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. We'll open it up to the board. Any questions for Undersecretary Vogel? Nope. Go ahead, Bryce.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks so much for that report. Amazing number of projects you're funding. Thank you so much for all that funding and for covering such a wide variety of needs and then goals and looking at immediate as well as future. Very impressive. In your opening remarks, you reminded us that we had extremes in our last winter, from the driest and then a few months of some of the wettest. And I was wondering if you could characterize how we performed in California during those. I mean, okay, first off, I've got to say thank you for your collaboration. The state team is doing amazing work and collaborating for us in the North State. Your collaboration with your team, with Secretary Crowfoot and Secretary Blumenfeld and Secretary Ross and Carla and Chuck, is amazing. Thank you for their engagement. And but I guess I was wondering, I know how we're doing in relationship to drought. You're working very hard, and I think things are better than they could be given that. But okay, the question is, how did we perform in October and December? in those times when we were wet, how do you think we did as far as utilizing those supplies that were in the rivers, in the system? I know it's one of our goals. I was wondering how you think we did on maximizing those supplies.
You know, honestly, Bryce, it's good to hear your voice. I can't see you that well, but I don't really know. I don't have it at my fingertips to tell you how much water was captured in our major reservoirs from those storms in October and December. Obviously, a lot of the precipitation arrived as snow, which is good and helpful. You're probably most interested in groundwater recharge. And I can't quantify the amount of recharge that happened as a result of those storms. I know you've, at the Board of Food and Ag, have heard recently from the State Water Resources Control Board, at least a few months ago, about the streamlined permitting that they have offered to help make it easier for landowners to recharge groundwater. And I'm understanding, I don't have a lot of fresh information at my fingertips, but I do know that they're starting to see more permit applications come in for recharge, which is good news. But I'm sorry, Bryce, I'm not the hydrologist. I can't answer your question very well.
No, thank you very much.
Go ahead. Michelle.
Thank you. Hi, I guess you can't see me, but this is Michelle Passero, and I appreciate that overview. I'm curious if you can speak to any of the main points of differences with the Senate and Assembly on the May revise, if you're able to speak to that.
No, I'm sorry. That's above my pay grade. I'm not involved in the negotiations with the legislative leaders, and I want to stay out of that.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. Do we have any other questions from the board at this time? Would you like to,
Have a second.
Bryce?
Nancy, I was wondering if you could give your sense of where you sit and your vantage. Everyone, I think, is doing their part. Urban, rural, industry, environment. But as you evaluate how California is responding to drought, would you say you could identify areas where it's going really well and areas of improvement? I saw a news clip the other day from a news show in Southern California, really critical of California agriculture, and I just sort of think where I'm from, we're going to hear it later today that senior water rights holders on the west side, a lot of them are just getting zero. Right, and ag is doing, I think, its part, but that's from where I'm sitting. From where you're sitting, do you think really all of California is doing their part?
I think that everyone can do better. I think that you'll see this morning at the State Water Resources Control Board, new numbers showing the levels of urban water conservation in May. I think it's May's month. Yeah, will be coming out, and we need to talk about those numbers. I don't expect them to be good. I don't expect them to be anywhere near the governor's 15% target. So obviously, we got a lot of big urban water districts that are, for example, doing a terrific job and urging people to cut back and restricting outdoor when people can water outdoors. Others need to catch up. Others need to do more. And in agriculture, when we talk about the need for conservation across statewide, we always discuss the fact that agriculture is getting cut back. Agriculture already is fallowing hundreds of thousands of acres. And then I do think we need to see the commercial and the institutional and industrial sector step up, and those business parks, for example, and those use beautiful green landscapes around headquarter buildings. We need to start rethinking those landscapes. And I think with the recent emergency regulations from the Water Board that restrict ornamental irrigation of ornamental turf, that may be one of the legacies of this drought, that Californians begin to change what is an acceptable landscape in terms of how we use water. So I think there's a lot more that can be done in the commercial sector. And agriculture obviously needs to continue to invest in efficiency. And then every individual Californian, even in those places where they've got, 42 per capita or per gallons per capita per day, they can, everybody can find a little bit more to do. So I don't want to see anyone pitting one sector against the other. We're all in this together. We all need to conserve the supplies that will help us get through next year if it's dry, and to meet the needs of all of our economy, our environment, and our people.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I have a question. When you say that we're fallowing hundreds of thousands of acres, is that per month, per week? What's the stat on that? And then are there any specific crops that you're seeing fallowed more than other crops?
I would like to turn to Karen.
Somehow I knew that was coming. Thank you, Nancy, for being with us today. So that is taking a look at this growing season. So there won't be crops coming off of those fields, or in some cases there will be reduced cuttings of alfalfa, but that's not complete fallowing. So what we identified through the UC Merced impact studies is land that will not grow any crop and will not produce any revenue for the year. Last year, just in the Central Valley alone, it was 385,000 acres. UC Merced, early estimates based on the cutbacks we already know about and combined with the implementation of SGMA and people already living under that, they expect that to double. That would be even more fallowed acres than we saw in the worst year of the last drought, which was 2015. What is extraordinary about this drought is the amount of fallowing in the Sacramento River Valley. And that will be talked about later today, but it's probably at least 250,000 acres of rice primarily that won't be planted there. In the Central Valley, it's annual crops, hopefully not processing tomatoes. But the first ones to go are annual crops. Everyone talks about cotton, but our total annual acreage of cotton is rarely above 300,000 acres, even at cotton prices the way that they are. It can be forage crops, although we're a feed deficit state, and my colleague to the right knows that we're really deficit on getting grain here by rail. So but it will be melons and peppers and onions and those types of annual crops will be the first ones to not be planted, which is kind of a shame because there's a global shortage of wheat, and this would have been a nice year with water if we could have grown some wheat. So that's what tends to go. We are seeing many more acres of almond trees being pulled. It's primarily almonds, and many of those are older, where there's still productivity left, but people are making a decision and trying to balance their water budget accordingly.
So do you see a concomitant drop in employment?
So the interesting thing right now is that for the last month, and part of this is just seasonal hiring, employment numbers actually bounced up a small amount. But last year, for direct on-farm jobs, it was approximately 8,500 jobs that were not created during the year. And combined with affiliated industries, both inputs or value added, it was almost 14,600 jobs that were not created last year. So that gives us an indicator. I think you'll also hear from Sacramento Valley, where rice is such a major driver, and all those jobs that go with that kind of fallowing, I think we'll see hard pain being suffered by the community, and they're very worried about workers staying in the community if they're not, because they're very dependent on several key crops like that. And I know there are others that can talk to that more than I can. It hurts.
Perhaps this is not the time to discuss this, but what are there efforts or thoughts about how we can help the people who are going to be laid off?
Yeah. So This is precedent setting. The May revise included $75 million for GoBiz to be able to do a grant program to ag and ag related. It will be by industrial code. Undersecretary Birdsong was very instrumental in working with GoBiz and Department of Finance of launching that program. It's a grant program similar to how the COVID relief payments went to small businesses and mid-sized businesses. And so that has been proposed. Unfortunately, the drought package got set aside along with climate and others, and so we may not. Well, I'm glad to hear Deputy Secretary Vogel's optimism that maybe that drought package will get negotiated over the next week, but it was set aside separately from the rest of the budget for further action and maybe more money. Who knows? And then there's the small farmer grant program at CDFA for $20 million.
Thank you, Secretary. Do we have any other questions from the board? Josh, could you check online for any public comments on this agenda item, please?
Yes, if you'd like to make public comment on this agenda item, please use your hand icon or the question and answer icon, and I will unmute your line. I'm seeing no public comment at this time.
Thank you, Josh. Very good. Thanks again, Nancy. I see you're still there with us. So always look forward to your reports and having you present before the board. So we'll see you again.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, we're going to move on to a panel discussion on Proposition 1 and the Sacramento and San Joaquin Delta updates. With us today, we have Joe Yun with the California Water Commission and Michael George from the State Water Resources Control Board. Joe is the Executive Director of the California Water Commission. The Commission provides a public forum for discussing water issues, advises the Director of the Department of Water Resources on matters within the Department's jurisdiction, approves rules and regulations related to the State Water Project. And Michael George was appointed the Delta Water Master in January of 2015. The Water Master has statutory responsibility for administering water rights within the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta and the Susan Marsh. Additionally, the Delta Water Master advises the board and the council on related water rights, water quality, and water operations in and affecting the Delta, which is simultaneously a critical estuary habitat, a vital ag area, and the hub of California's water infrastructure. So welcome to both of you. Good to have you with us today.
Okay, is this on? There. I can hear myself. And then slides. Do we have slides? While that's coming up, I'll just say good morning, Secretary Ross and President Cameron and Executive Director Eddy and board members. Thank you so much for having me this morning, and thank you for inviting some of my commissioners over to sit in your meeting. I think it's good to talk about water and ag, and we've been talking a while in our realm about how do we do that. So it's good to see that we're here today. If we could go to the next slide, please. President Cameron kind of introduced the commission, but I'll say a little bit about the commission just so there's some orientation. Our mission is to use our public forum to explore water management issues and make recommendations to the Department of Water Resources and, as appropriate, other governmental bodies regarding ways to improve water planning and management in response to changing hydrology. The commission is made up of 9 governor-appointed members, 7 for their general knowledge of water, and 2 are chosen for their knowledge of the environment. And you will notice that I don't have 9 pictures up there because we're short a couple, but I think you guys probably know what that's like. Next slide, please. So the Water Commission supports California's overall resilience, and it's focused on longer-term efforts. For example, in terms of drought, the commission's work is related to a water resilience portfolio item, and that is not the immediate drought efforts or actions that are the purview of other state agencies. I'll be spending time today talking about our water storage investment program mostly, but I'll also want to touch a little bit on our work as it relates to drought through the resilience portfolio and also our state water project review. So next slide. Talk a little bit about the water storage program. The water storage investment program is the reason the commission was reconstituted by Governor Schwarzenegger in 2010. Proposition 1 then passed in 2014. It dedicated $2.7 billion for investments in the public benefits of water storage projects. The public benefits the Commission can consider when determining their investments are specified as ecosystem improvement, water quality improvement, flood control, emergency response, and recreation. The public benefits may vary from project to project, but each project must provide ecosystem benefit. Next slide. Proposition 1 prohibits the Commission from making final awards until the project is shovel-ready. The Commission made conditional funding determinations, what we call maximum conditional eligibility determinations, and that is a big word that I have to say all the time, which is the maximum amount the state would invest in a project conditioned on the project meeting all Prop 1 requirements. The Commission took that action because it helps provide some certainty for projects so that they can move and work with their partners, their other partners, to advance projects to obtain the Prop 1 requirements that we need to make final award. The Commission made MCEDs in the summer of 2018, and at that point, projects moved forward on their own timelines, with the Commission being ready to make decisions as applicants obtain statutory requirements. There are 7 projects within our program, and if built, as Nancy said, or Deputy Secretary Vogel said, 2.77 million acre-feet of added storage capacity. And just to tie back to our drought theme today, the emergency response benefits that some of our projects does include drought deliveries. Slide 6. Next slide, please. So there are 2 groups of statutory requirements that I wanted to touch on today. The upper set of bullets on your slide there are what I call the January 1, 2022 requirements. The statute required projects to meet certain things by 2022. So let me look at my talking points. I just lost my place. So the January 1, 2022 requirements were put in place, my best guess, to ensure that the projects could make some progress in their planning. Projects were allowed to meet these requirements anytime after the 2018 MCEDs were established. All the projects did pass these requirements. They all came to the Commission, but they all came in October, November, and December of 2021. Applicants are working on that second set of requirements. That's a lower section of your slide. Those are the requirements that the Commission needs the applicants to meet in order for us, the Commission, to make the final funding decisions. Next slide, please. So here's a look at the physical distribution of projects in the state. We have 3 surface water projects sites, Los Vaqueros and Pacheco. We have 4 groundwater-related projects, Harvest Water, Kern Fan, Willow Springs, and Chino Basin. Next slide. Here is a look at project timelines. So these timelines were initially provided by projects with their applications. Applicants provide the Commission quarterly progress reports, and we use that information to update these timelines. All this information is on our website. These timelines have changed slightly over time, but generally they are pretty consistent to the schedules that came in during the application. So based on these timelines, we anticipate final awards starting late this year, 2022, and extending through 2025. And just one point I'll make is, as projects all established feasibility around January 1, 2022, they do need some time to move to shovel-ready to achieve those requirements that we need to make final award. Next slide, please. So here's a funding summary, and this is my last slide for the Water Storage Investment Program. The total cost figures, if you add that up, it's around $8.5 billion. The MCEDs I've talked about, those are the Commission's conditional determinations. Early funding, so Proposition 1 does allow for a small amount of funding for projects to work on environmental documents and permits. And so the Commission has awarded $116 million to date to help projects with those items. I think that wraps up my information on the WISIP. I'll touch real quickly on the other Commission work, and then we'll move on from there. So next slide, please. So the Commission has found that it's able to have robust public discussions with a wide array of stakeholders on water management issues, and this has helped the Commission with work on 3 water resilience portfolio actions. Action 19.4 was actually assigned to the Commission when the portfolio was drafted. So we did do a large stakeholder involvement piece with that to figure out what should the state role be in financing conveyance. That included a lot of interviews with lots of stakeholders just to frame the conversation and the question. We had expert panels in Commission meetings so the Commission could hear more in-depth information on specific topics around a role a state agency could play. And then we sought public input through workshops throughout the state. And we took all that information and we drafted a white paper that is really aimed at policymakers and funding agencies. And so DWR, subsequent to us finishing that up, DWR did get some money to run a multi-year conveyance subsidence repair program. And so they did use our white paper in developing their program. So that is an ongoing program that DWR is running. And then based on our work in Action 19.4, the Commission was asked to take the first steps in Action 3.6, which is really around groundwater trading and basin trading within a basin. So that's what we were talking about. Groundwater trading is seen as one way to help ease the economic impact as basins move towards sustainability. It may also help in times of drought. That white paper was approved by the Commission at its May meeting, and DWR is picking up that white paper and drafting a work plan to build on the white paper and to begin to implement Action 3.6. We're just starting Action 26.3, which is looking at strategies to protect communities and fish and wildlife in the event of a drought lasting at least 6 years. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that. So our 6-year drought work plan will include learning about how governments in other parts of the world have handled long-term drought situations and investigating potential strategies for managing long-term drought, and we'll be coordinating with state agencies to develop a framework so that we can advance this longer-term work without impacting immediate drought response actions. The Commission will again produce a guidance document for a state agency, in this case CNRA, to consider as they implement Action 26.3. And I would just say in July, at our July 20th Commission meeting, we'll start having a drought panel discussion to understand how droughts are changing and from the past into the present and in the future. And so I certainly do want to extend a reverse invite and have some of you all at our Commission meeting, and I'll work with Executive Director Eddie as our meeting shapes up, so he'll have that information and can extend that to you. Next slide, please. So lastly, the Commission, as a requirement of the Water Code, the Commission does do an annual review of the construction and operation of the State Water Project. That review is sent to the state legislature and to the director every year with our recommendations. I just wanted to touch, given our theme of today's meeting, on our theme for 2022, which is preparing for climate extremes and ensuring a reliable state water project to meet the challenges of drought, flood, and wildfire. So that is a quick tour of the commission and what we've been doing with storage and some of our other pieces of drought work. I'm happy to take questions. We can wait till the end if you want Michael to go next, either way, but I appreciate your time and attention. That final slide is, there's one more slide, it's simply my contact information, but thank you for your time.
Thank you, Joe. If you don't mind, maybe we'll wait till we hear our other presentation, then we'll go to questions.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you and good morning. I'm pleased to be back before you and have an opportunity to give you an update on what's happening in the Delta, and specifically in light of your theme of water. Joe and Nancy have done a great job of kind of setting the stage broadly across the state and what's happening in terms of creating greater resiliency, making investments in long-term improvements, and improving our ability to manage droughts as we go forward, because we all anticipate that they will continue to be a problem to be dealt with. So I want to focus, though, on my own swim lane, which is the legal delta. That's defined in the Water Code as the area at the bottom of the watershed. The Delta watershed drains approximately 40% of the land in California, but it drains to the Delta, and that is a unique area. It's about 750,000 acres, roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island. And it's important to recognize that it is not a monolith. The Delta is not the same throughout that 750,000 acres. It's different regions with different challenges that need to be managed and overseen in ways that are unique to those different challenges, different areas. Those different areas relate to elevation above or below sea level, the different types of soil from very organic to mineral, transmissive to clay-like soils. And recognizing those distinct regions, we also have to recognize that the Delta that we know today is a highly engineered place. It came about as a result of both public and private investments in strategies that were designed to, in the argot of the day, drain the swamps to create farmable land. So obviously that public policy has had a series of consequences that we're dealing with today, partly because of the consequences of those actions, dredging channels, channelizing the flows in and out of the Delta, creating levees, dealing with the subsidence of those organic soils. But it is important, and I always think of this as a good lesson in regulatory humility, that sometimes our best plans have consequences that we have to deal with new plans going forward. And I think that's one of the main takeaways of my tenure as Delta Water Master, is that we have a highly engineered system that we have to maintain in some fashion, because the Delta as it exists today is subject to a lot of dynamic forces, primarily climate change, but many, many others. And so dealing in a dynamic environment, we have to recognize that doing nothing is not a solution, that not to decide is to decide, and to recognize that the Delta in its current configuration is physically unsustainable. So we have to continue to manage actively with a sense of regulatory humility, because we have created programs in the past that have created problems that we're dealing with in the present. But the final thing I want to say about the legal Delta, the area that starts roughly on the Sacramento River at the I Street Bridge, on the San Joaquin River at the Airport Way Bridge in Vernalis. Involves input also from the Colomé, the Cosumnes, and some smaller creeks. And then all collects that watershed water and has its outlet to San Francisco Bay at the Carquinez Strait. And the most important thing about that is that too often we think of the Delta as essentially an extension of the river systems that feed it, essentially a continuation of the tributaries out to the point where freshwater meets saline water. When in fact, the conceptual analysis that we should have is more that what we're dealing with is a tidal estuary with modest but critically important freshwater flows, because we use those modest freshwater flows to manage against the infiltration of saline water from the bay. And just to put it in perspective, today we've got probably a couple, 3,000, 4,000 cubic feet per second of net river outflow. But that net river outflow occurs in the context of twice daily tidal flushes and rescissions that at the Carquinez Strait, at that choke point in the system, average around 300,000 cubic feet per second. So put that in perspective. Say we've got 5,000 of net river flow to manage against inflows and outflows twice a day of 300,000 CFS. So that's a sense for the amazing complexity that we're dealing with that is compounded in the drought when that net freshwater flow is so constrained and the tides continue to bring salt in and out of the delta on a regular basis. And even that regularity with respect to the tides is influenced dramatically by changes outside the freshwater system, the alignment of the moon and the sun, the timing of the tides, the diurnal changes. And so in that complex circumstance, the second point I want to make is that drought is experienced differently in the delta, in the legal delta, than it is in the delta watershed, than it is in riverine systems throughout the state. That is, it's not a matter of lack of physical supply of water. Rather, it's a risk to the quality of that water, the availability of water that can be used for agriculture, for export, for municipal and industrial uses. And so when we think about responding to drought in the Delta, we have to keep in the mind that it is experienced differently in the Delta. And that's one reason, as Nancy talked about, the funding of the temporary salinity barrier at Old False River. Without that rock barrier, the saline influence could overcome the reduced net freshwater flows. That's why it was put in last year. That's why instead of taking it out, as its permits required last November, the Department of Water Resources sought and got permission to leave it in, to simply notch it in the middle for boat passage, and at the time we thought fish passage, which didn't work out so well. Another story entirely. But it does emphasize that risk of saline intrusion, and particularly through that nozzle, if you will, at False River, which was opened instead of being a false river to make a channel. Well, that channel now acts like a nozzle into Frank's Tract, an area that was reclaimed for irrigable agriculture, but the levees failed. It's now a large open water body, and that nozzle of False River brings saline water in that direction, and that's why that's the strategic point at which the salinity barrier was created. So in all this compounding and confounding complexity, we're challenged by a lack of understanding of how the Delta works internally in its various areas because of a variety of data which don't talk to each other and some of which are inherently unreliable, many of which come too late to be acted upon. Now, we've been working really hard, and I'm going to go into some of the things we've been doing to improve the quality, the timeliness, and the reliability of data so that we can reduce the extent to which we argue about what's happening, and we can take what we hopefully will know and understand better as what is happening to inform our decisions. That doesn't mean we're going to solve all the complexity. It doesn't mean we're going to solve the very basic disagreements that are inherent in our water allocation system. But it does mean, I hope, that we'll be able to move away from arguing about what the facts are to arguing about how we should manage and respond to the facts that we hold in common. So I've spent a great deal of my tenure, as Secretary Ross knows and has been extraordinarily helpful in, is trying to improve the timeliness of our data and the accuracy of our data, and to make sure that the farming operations in the Delta remain viable. Because the profitability and viability of farming within the Delta is critical to all of us, not just to the farmers, because frankly, there is no plan B for managing the land in the Delta in this highly engineered system. We've got to have incentivized farmers on the land, paying attention to it, managing the levees, and earning sufficient profits to maintain their operations. So one of the things that we have been helped by in this process of trying to get better data and more timely data that is reliable is the development over the last 6 or 7 years of continuously refined ability to use computer analysis of satellite data in a system now called OpenET, which went public last October, and which we're now using in the Delta to identify the largest source of water use in the Delta, which is subject to management. And that is the water that we take out of the natural system and apply to our crops. There are lots of other water uses in the Delta that we don't control. Evaporation from open water, ET from riparian vegetation, ET from invasive weeds, all kinds of things that we don't manage, but we do actively manage the water that we withdraw from the environment and apply to critical agriculture. And we now have a tool in this OpenET to use data from satellites to calculate the amount of evapotranspiration from those crops. And it's critical because until we have this tool, we haven't been able to do that in anything like real time. And the other thing about OpenET is it manages the water that is withdrawn from the system for the specific ag purpose. It's not capable yet of evaluating or analyzing or calculating the ET of that riparian vegetation, which is much more complicated, multi-stories in its canopy, et cetera. But much better data, much more timely data. Instead of getting water use reports in July of the following year, when you're already in the middle of the irrigation season, we've now got, in OpenET, about a 6-week latency period from the moment of ET, if you can consider that a moment, to when we get reports is about 6 weeks. We think by the end of the current water year, we may have that latency period down to 2 weeks, and ultimately we hope to get it down to a day or two, taking into account the diurnal effects of the tides. Probably aren't going to get much closer to real time than that. We're using that in a number of ways. One is to shift the way we report water use in the Delta, that is agricultural crop water use in the Delta, from this user-reported guesstimates or even in many cases, measure diversions and instead move toward a system that is unbiased, is not dependent on, for instance, a ditch tender remembering when he turned on the siphon, how long it went, when he came back to turn it off, when the farmer reached the sufficient diversion and turned it off himself. All of these factors that have reduced the credibility of these long-delayed self-reporting, we're now getting that data in closer to real time. We've also used OpenET to assist us in a year-long investigation that the Office of the Delta Water Master, my office, plus the Water Board's Division of Water Rights has conducted in cooperation with complainants from the Central Valley and State Water Project contracting groups. So they filed a complaint in June a year ago alleging that there were unlawful diversions in the Delta, which were taking water to which they were not entitled, which interfered, obviously, with the operation of the projects. So we've brought the complainants together in an investigation that the Office of the Delta Water Master and the Division of Water Rights have jointly been responsible for to see how we can identify from the basis of the complaint, which was kind of a mass balance analysis, how much water is let go from the project reservoirs, how much falls as rain below the rim dams, how much goes out as net delta outflow, how much is taken out for exports, and the leftover, viewed as depletions within the delta, put in context of how much project water was released up at those rim reservoirs. We are about to circulate for review by the complainants a final summary and report of that investigation. It should come out within the next month or so, and after internal review, it'll be made public and published on our website. But shouldn't come as any surprise that the mass balance analysis was not sufficiently granular, did not have sufficient accuracy of data at a level which would allow us to bring an enforcement action against any particular diverter. That doesn't mean that we've just thrown up our hands, because the investigation also points the way to using some of these other tools to better understand where and when we might intervene if required because of unlawful diversions. I'll come back to that later. We've also gone back to unscramble the unholy mess that is the water rights allocation system, which particularly in the Delta brings into conflict, kind of unresolvable conflict between the way we allocate water shortage among riparian interests versus appropriators. Appropriators share shortage by priority. First priority, first in time, first in right. Whereas riparians theoretically share shortage correlatively. That is, they share shortage. Now that worked pretty well where riparian rights were developed in the common law of England, where you had running streams instead of ephemeral streams that run seasonally. In any case, we've got both systems, and we've never reconciled the distinction between how shortages are allocated. So we've tried to separate water rights and determine which water rights are in that riparian system, which water rights are in the appropriative system, so that we can at least get a better handle on how to manage shortage. In addition, this year, because of the need for better data about what actions could be taken within the Delta to conserve water or to protect against the risk of saline intrusion, the Department of Water Resources, in conjunction with the Delta Conservancy and Delta water users and our office developed the Delta Dry Year Response Pilot Program to make investments, to make grants to farmers who would volunteer to take specific actions aimed at demonstrating how much a conservation action could result in actual conserved water measured independently by OpenET. So we had farmers say, I'll forego my summer crop, I'll forego corn or tomatoes, and instead I'll harvest my winter wheat and then leave the stubble in the ground. Why leave the stubble in the ground? This goes back to the Department of Food and Agriculture's Healthy Soils program. Leave those roots in the ground to protect the soil and to maintain a better soil condition for the next crop year. That program runs through the end of the water year on September 30th. We've got kind of early anecdotal information, but it is very much anecdotal. There were 85 applications, 35 of which were funded. In each case, we're doing monitoring to look at what the action resulted in, and we're comparing it both to what happened on that same land a year ago, but probably more importantly, what's happening on a nearby field under the same conditions. So if the farmer said, I'll forego my corn crop, leave my stubble in the field, then we looked for a farmer who, business as usual, put in his corn crop next door in the same area so that we can compare apples to apples as well as the same field this year to last year. Over time, these data will help us understand what we should do in the future. As Nancy mentioned, Undersecretary Vogel mentioned in her presentation, the Dry Year Response Pilot Program is sufficiently promising that in the governor's revision, there's another $10 million to fund this program for next year, because we realize even before we get the data from the pilot program, we're going to end the year with depleted reservoirs. We better be prepared for another dry year. So I'm going to finish by talking about what's happening pretty much today in the Delta, what's going on with curtailments under the emergency regulations that the board, the Water Board, developed last August and has indicated an intention to extend beyond its one-year life. So we're going into, we are planning for the possibility that we'll be in another dry year and entering it with those depleted reservoirs. So one thing that has happened from the last drought is the Division of Water Rights has taken the lead in improving our methodology for comparing supply and demand at a much more granular level throughout the Delta watershed. Under the emergency regulations, that methodology has been put in place as the way we're going to measure supply and demand throughout the watershed. There are weekly updates that are published on the division's water site. The next one will be published today. We got a bit of a break from some of those late spring storms and some of the cooler than normal weather that we've experienced. Obviously putting off some of the fire risk that's inevitable in the watershed for a dry year. But as of last Friday, we triggered Term 91, which is a curtailment device for relatively junior licensed rights. They've now been cut off as of last Friday. That's probably going to continue until we get significant precipitation in the fall. We're continuing to refine the methodology within the legal delta. Because of all those complexities I've described, the methodology is not yet at a level of granularity, consistency, and accuracy at the point of diversion to allow us to determine when to curtail water rights. Instead, we're relying on a lot of voluntary agreements, some of which are in the response program. But I will tell you that farmers in the Delta, out of the 85 that applied, 35 that got grants, almost 50 followed through on their actions and said, we face the risk of salinity intrusion, so we're going to follow through. If you state at your cost, we'll monitor what we're doing so that you can help us understand what the impacts of our actions are going forward. So it's a real indication that it wasn't just farmers looking for those grants, it was farmers trying to figure out actions that they could take that would protect the water quality in the Delta. And so I guess the final thing I have to say is that I think into the future, we're pursuing a path where we believe that better data will lead to better understanding, better management outcomes that are more predictable, and that can allow us maybe even to get beyond the kind of bickering about whose fault it is, and more toward what can we do based on common, credible data to manage the system better. And I'll stop with that, and happy to have questions for either Joe or me.
No, I'd like to thank both of you. Really excellent presentations. I understand the Delta is extremely a complex region to work with. And maybe I'll open it up with a question to you concerning that. I guess my understanding is you're saying that there really hasn't been a lot of measuring that with the growers in your region. They're not metered. So you're going to rely on your essentially aerial photos for water measurement with essentially ET in the future. That's correct. At the end of the last drought, in a trailer bill, SB 88, it was the first time there was a requirement to measure all diversions down to a relatively small level, small for agricultural purposes, 10 acre feet per acre. So it was only then that the requirement to measure each diversion came into the code. In the Delta, it's pretty complex. And as we developed implementing regulations, which the board adopted in early 2016, in the fall of 2016, I first became aware of the challenges specific to the Delta, because one of the primary proponents of that SB 88 was the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy invited me out to the island that they manage in the Delta, Staten Island, the northern part of the Delta, and they basically said, look, we spent about $40,000 so far to try and measure our diversions on the Delta, and what we found is that we cannot do so anywhere near the requirements in the regulation of plus or minus 10%. And the primary reason for that was it's not like measurement in most parts of the Delta where you measure from a pump. Instead, in the Delta, you're often trying to measure siphons, and siphons are inherently difficult to measure. There's turbulence at the top of the siphon. There's a lot of debris in the water that gets sucked up into those siphons, completely destroyed traditional propeller meters. And so we said, let's stop. Let's start something that ultimately became the Delta Measurement Experimentation Consortium. We convened it, but it's a voluntary group of water users in the Delta, independently funded, no state funds involved, as I say, totally voluntary, because we said, look, let's do some different things. Let's figure out what works. Let's find the best response rather than everybody going out and trying to do the same thing, listening to the meter manufacturers selling their various products. Let's figure out what works. Let's share our experiments. And since the spring of 2017, that consortium has met every quarter and shared experiments and so forth. That led me in my position as Delta Water Master to making a determination that was pretty critical a year and a half ago, to say that strict compliance with the measurement regulation
in many parts of the Delta was impossible. And in any case, the data that we were getting from those measured diversions was interrupted by various outages and so forth. And so we said, while we continue to do the experimentation on measurement, let's pivot to this alternative compliance plan using the emerging OpenET. So this year, we are using OpenET since the 1st of October of 2022, the beginning of the current water year, through the end of the water year, which will be September 30th. And we'll use OpenET to inform those unmeasured diversions, not measuring the diversion, but measuring the loss of water from the system through crop irrigation. So that's where we are and where we're moving. Now, again, I want to point out that the consortium continues to meet because we've got a number of measured irrigation devices within the Delta. We're knitting them together with real-time telemeter data so that we can start to have the data talk to each other, look at the places where we're measuring, compare it to places where we're calculating just the ET to see what those correlations are. So we're continuing to move forward, but we're making progress in some part because we recognize that we weren't going to get there in the way we anticipated. And so, to use an overused term, I think we've been adaptively managing to the imperfect system that we have to try and get better data that we can actually make management decisions on.
Thank you. Glenda? Bryce?
I'm afraid of this question because you know so much more about this than I do.
Thank you for the presentation. It was great. One comment you made really caught my attention. I've long been a fan of the concept of developing a very effective, efficient framework for compensating landowners for ecosystem services. And one of the challenges we have that is that all too often, particularly farmers, who ecosystem services include food and fiber, but there's so many other services, as we all know. It's easy to just say, oh yeah, they can go somewhere else or they can shut them down or whatever. But your comment about the landowners in the Delta, there's no plan B, struck home because I think you're right. There really isn't, and certainly not one that's cost effective. Has there been any exploration of the idea of how some form of compensation or recognition of ecosystem services for those landowners, farmers, land resource managers like the Nature Conservancy in the Delta, how that might be part of the management or investment scheme there?
Yes, I would say we're at a relatively early stage in that investigation, but there's a lot of stuff going on. As you point out, farmers are reluctant to get pulled into ecosystem restoration because they fear that they're being pulled into long-term decisions that may not be sustainable for them economically or environmentally. And part of that is in the ecosystem restoration approach, the political response has been, well, let's start with public lands first. And there are a lot of public lands in the Delta. Sherman and Twitchell Island are owned by the Division of the Department of Water Resources. Sherman Island, as I've mentioned, is owned by the Nature Conservancy, which purchased that with bond funds. The Metropolitan Water District of Southern California bought 4 islands, about 20,000 acres in the central part of the Delta. So there is a lot of public land that is being investigated for ecosystem restoration.
Yeah, but I want to clarify. I'm not talking just about ecosystem services restoration. I'm talking about the fact that farmers, in the course of raising food and fiber, already produce a lot of ecosystem services for which they're not compensated. And how can we potentially compensate for those just to maintain good land management going forward. I'm not talking about public lands and restoration.
Fair enough, and that's a great point. I'm sorry I missed it the first time through. So, there are a lot of ecosystem services that are provided by agriculture. Here, I would say one of the risks is the sense that the ecosystem services that are kind of naturally provided in a lot of farm operations maybe get sacrificed if the farmer moves, let's say, from a field crop, an annual crop, alfalfa or corn, tomatoes, whatever, to a crop that is not so ecosystem friendly, say vines or orchards. So there is a concern that those ecosystem benefits may be locked into place in a way that could be detrimental. And I think, for instance, I'm familiar with the Marin Area Land Trust, which was a well-funded, well-developed plan for taking a lot of agricultural areas in western Marin and providing essentially ecosystem benefit easements on those. Phenomenally successful. Except that maintaining the bucolic nature of western Marin was fine for the 30 years of since those easements were put in place, but may not be sustainable in the long term for the kind of farming that was kind of built into the mechanism, primarily large dairy operations. So I would say that farmers are, I'm a lawyer, not a farmer. I'm always careful to say I don't understand this stuff as well as the guys who got dirt under their fingernails and boots on the ground. I try to learn from them. But I think there is some skepticism that getting drawn into public programs to maintain those ecosystem functions could put them in the future in an unsustainable economic circumstance. All that said, there are no climate deniers in the Delta. Farmers in the Delta experience climate change every day, regardless of their political persuasion. And those political persuasions are all over the place, as you can appreciate. But people are trying to figure out what can work and what can work in the long term. And I think there is a place for public subsidies for agriculture for those public benefits that we get from it. And I hope we're going to see more of that. One of the things that I think is positive about that is this dry year response pilot program. It really brought farmers in. We said to them, you tell us, you know your fields better than any of us. What would you do in order to protect your water quality in the face of the drought? What do you think could work? And, they came out in larger numbers than we had anticipated, and they've been really good cooperators so far. And we go out there ostensibly for on-site monitoring and investigation, making sure they're doing what they're saying they're doing. But I'm telling you, whatever I get from going out there to do an inspection, I get much more in terms of just listening to the farmer and understanding what he or she sees in the field they know better than anybody.
Public comment? Okay. All right. We're going to go ahead, go to public comment. Anyone in the audience is more than welcome to step forward and ask our presenters questions. And Josh is also going to be looking online to see if we have any questions there. So I really do appreciate it, and I compliment your growers on being proactive and looking long term, because without that, nothing but, like I say, problems ahead.
Thank you.
If you'd like to make public comment on this agenda item, please use your hand icon and I will unmute your line.
while we're waiting, I just wanted to thank Joe and the commission for the hard work the last few years. I know you get a lot of questions about where the money is and why isn't it out and why aren't these things built. But I just wanted you to know how much we appreciate the work and the process that was prescribed very carefully in that bond. So I think it was really important for everyone here today to see where you are. And I love the visuals of when they'll be starting to be online. It's exciting. Of course, we all wish it would be faster, but it's really good to see it's going to happen in this decade by the looks of it, and that's a really good thing. So I just wanted to say thank you. I think it's really important to acknowledge that good work. It's like, there's something besides sites on there, right?
2.7 million. I love that.
Yeah, there you go.
And I'm seeing no public comment online.
All right, well, gentlemen, really thank you both for being here and presenting today. Really useful information, and I have to echo Karen's response to having the members of the Water Commission here and the Executive Director. I think getting the information out to the public is critical, and really appreciate all of you being here today. We'll hear more from you later, so thank you. All right. We are going to move on to the Sacramento Valley drought impacts. We have with us today Tim Johnson from the California Rice Commission and Frank Muller, who's going to be representing tomatoes and the California Tomato Association as a member of the association. Tim Johnson is the president and CEO of the California Rice Commission. The organization supports approximately 2,500 growers and handlers of rice in California, while Frank is the president of M3 Ranches located in Woodland, California. Frank is a grower of processing tomatoes, specialty peppers, and other crops. And Frank is also a member of the California Tomato Growers Association. But before we get started, I'd like to call on Bryce for a few comments on the North State drought.
Thank you, President Cameron. The 2020 and 2021 drought were really bad. This 2022 drought is going to be incredibly severe, and the drought reaches further and further, I would say, into the Sacramento Valley, and the impacts in our region are going to be significant. Of course, it affects the entire state, but it affects urban and rural, ag, industry, cities, environment, both terrestrial and aquatic species. In our region, the impacts to the crop I grow, rice, is going to be severe, and I look forward to hearing what you have for us today, Tim. I want to thank Karen Ross and Governor Newsom, Secretary Crowfoot, Secretary Blumenfeld, Chuck Bonham, Carla Nemeth, and Nancy Vogel, Metropolitan Water District, Northern California Water Association, for working together in our region. Started last fall in a series of scenario planning, and it is that collaboration, the partnership, the working together that will make what's really bad from being even worse. And I want to thank you for your outreach, Karen, and the administration, and for recognizing the needs and the funding that you're providing. I think preparation is such an important thing, and being prepared for drought will be something we all need to do every year, whether or not we have a drought or not. The preparation for drought is so important. My grandson, Gavin, he is in elementary school, and he was asked a math question by his teacher. You have 20 sheep in a pen and one gets loose. How many do you have, Gavin? And he thought for a little bit and said, well, I think that would be 0. And his teacher said, well, Gavin, maybe you didn't understand the question. And he said, well, I understood the question, but I also understand sheep. And I just want to say, I think the people on the panel today understand the book issue and how it affects us straight up, but you also understand adaptive management, and you understand the local impacts on the ground. And I look forward to what you have to say today.
Every time, how do you follow that? Well, if I might, I just want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary, for the opportunity to address you today. I realize I only now know about half of you around the room, which is my fault, not yours. So I want to talk a little bit about the Rice Commission at the beginning, right? We are you, right? We are one of the statutory organizations under the Food and Ag Code. We operate maybe a little more broadly than some of the other programs that you'll see, and I hope you'll see the benefit to the state of California, certainly to our members, of our ability to gauge very broadly on issues that impact our industry. So I've been the CEO of the California Rice Commission now for 27 years, as they remind me, and this is by far the most significant impact on our industry in my tenure. And we've had some real interesting ones over the years. What I'm going to do is I'll address the impacts of the drought on the Sacramento Valley, primarily around rice. I'll talk about the impacts to our communities and on habitat. And then speak specifically to a drought grant program that the Secretary was very instrumental in getting in the May budget revise. As I noted, this is the most significant impact on our industry in my memory. 250,000 acres is what will grow this year. That might sound like a lot, but in fact, that is only half a crop. On average, we produce rice on about 500,000 acres annually. And that's your sushi rice, all right? Sushi rice across the United States, many places we export our rice, all come from right here in the Sacramento Valley, something to be proud of. To give you an idea of when was the last time we planted 250,000 acres of rice, 1956, right? I think my dad at the time was just graduating grammar school. What does that mean for our valley, Sacramento Valley? Not just rice, but everything. We had Dr. Dan Sumner at UC Davis prepare a white paper. I sent it to Josh this morning, available for you as a board. It looks at the valley as a whole, right? Also calls out rice specifically because there's, as Glenda knows, some special data at USDA around rice. We will lose this year as a result of the drought 14,300 jobs. $1.3 billion in lost economic value. And if you're not an economist, that's the income that workers and farm operators would otherwise realize. From a rice perspective, a third of that impact will come from my crop with regard to economic impact. Half of the value of that economic impact will come from my crop, a third of the jobs, and 3/4 of the lost wages will come out of rice, right? The thing that's important to remember if you've not been in the Sacramento Valley is that this is not an equally distributed drought. We'll produce half a rice crop, but folks in Glenn and Colusa counties, portions of Yolo County, portions of Sutter County that are served off of the Sacramento River, right, Shasta Reservoir, will functionally grow no rice this year. It's 100% for them, okay? On the east side of the valley, which would be the east side of the Sacramento River, irrigation's district fed by the Yuba River, the Feather River, out of Lake Oroville, out of Bullard's Bar. They'll grow about as much rice as last year, all right? They're able to also augment with some groundwater to really be able to help out the industry as a whole, which is going to have, as I'll note, just some very significant impacts. So I go to a board meeting just like last week, half of the room, about a year like last year, maybe a little bit better, in the face of the highest prices paid for rice ever, right, Bryce? It'll be okay over there. It's devastating if you're in Colusa County. It's devastating if you're in the town of Willows. Now, the impacts on our industry that we're concerned about are not primarily focused on growers. Why would that be? As Glenda and others know, USDA has a very robust crop insurance program for rice. The most significant coverage that we participate in times like this is what we call preventive planting. It means if you're unable to plant your crop, you're able to at least get an indemnity, a crop insurance payment that will cover your variable cost of production, help you cover some of your fixed costs, right? So farmers in this drought will be okay. But what will not be okay are our communities and our employees, right? They don't have crop insurance. Our support industries don't have crop insurance. What does that look like? That's aerial applicators, crop dusters, right, in common parlance. The rice dryers, those big silos you see as you drive from here to Chico, where we take the rice from the field, we dry it, we store it until we need it. Those folks are impacted. Fertilizer suppliers, right? And of course, rice mills, which some are wholly dependent on rice grown in that Glen-Colusa area. They really have no base. Some that are a little bit broader, like the farmer cooperatives that we have, might gather rice from across the state. They still only have half a crop, but it's significant. And why are we focused on our employees? Why are we focused on these support industries? Because thankful for crop insurance, we can come back next year. But you can't come back and farm if you don't have an aerial applicator who not only applies our crop protection materials, but importantly, they're the folks that sow our rice seed every single year on almost every acre in the state, right? And we're 95% rice in the Sacramento Valley. So for us, it's all about the Sacramento Valley. Crop dusters go out of business. Rice dryers go out of business. We come back, we say, hey, we're all ready to farm and we'd like some fertilizer. Could you please sow our rice seed, and then we'll grow a crop, we'll put it in the dryer. And it's very likely that those folks on a regional basis are not going to be available. So the charge that my board gave me was let us help our communities, let us help our employees. To give you an idea of the order of magnitude, you might think, well, why don't you just do business on the other place where they are growing rice, right? Just move over to Butte County. That's God's country over there, Bryce. Just move our operation over to Butte County. Well, you can't move a rice dryer. People aren't going to truck rice, right? If you got plenty of storage over in Butte County, you don't want to drive a truck a long way. Very expensive, not great from an air quality perspective. You're not going to take rice to Colusa County. Similarly, if you're an aerial applicator, you have a business that applies crop protection materials and seed to a number of acres in your community, right? Richter Aviation, 25,000 acre operation, about 8 planes and about 20 employees. Instead of 25,000 acres this year, he is only able to service 5,000 acres, right? And of the 8 employees that he has, he's the only pilot that will stay this year. He'll have himself, his son, who once rice planting is done, will move to go fly the corn industry in the Midwest, and 1 or 2 support employees that he's able to keep. The other impact, and for some of you who might be a little bit more new to rice, is our impact on habitat, right? The historic wetlands in California are gone, right? We did it, not we rice, but we as the state of California did it. Why did we do it? Because we were tired of flooding, right? We put up dams, we put up levees to keep our cities safe, right? And then the farmers came in and said, hey, we can farm that. And so they did, right? But those wetlands are gone. Rice, an aquatic crop, one of the few in the state, provides unparalleled wetland-like habitat on those fields that are in production. But if the fields are not in production, right, you don't have that habitat value now while we grow our crop, but importantly, in the wintertime when we're done harvesting, we reflood those rice fields and provide 60% of the food for the ducks and the geese. There's about 5 to 7 million of them that come down from the Pacific Flyway from Canada and Alaska. They winter in the Sacramento Valley, in south in the San Joaquin Valley as well. 60% of that food is the leftover rice, it's the weed seeds, it's the insects. During the growing season, we provide habitat for giant garter snake. It's just a really long, stripy black and yellow garter snake, right? Just as big, but it's very unique to the Sacramento Valley. It is dependent on rice fields. It's also dependent on the water that's in the ditches that the irrigation districts supply. And without rice in those ditches, or water in those ditches and rice in those fields, they have no habitat. We're shorebird habitat of international significance, our rice fields and the adjoining wetlands. On an average year, we flood 300,000 acres of rice in the wintertime for that habitat. And we're not even going to plant 300,000 acres of rice this year. We have been collaborating and scrambling again this second year to work with our wetland partners, to work with our irrigation district partners to try to find out how many acres can we flood, right? How can we maximize the land that has been planted to rice, maybe use some fallowed land and provide that habitat. When farmers typically, folks think, are not worried about stuff on their farm, right, and on their land, but we've been working on that since the beginning of the year. In fact, that habitat is so important, and it's a partial answer to the question that was asked in the previous panel. Is there any consideration given to farmers, ways that you can kind of help out on the ecosystem services? Last year, DWR provided the rice industry a grant, and will provide a larger grant this year to help us flood those winter fields, specifically for wildlife and for habitat. So as we look at this challenge, there have been a number and a new, in fact, very innovative effort that I want to particularly call this board's attention to and thank the Secretary. We're deeply appreciative of the California Small Agricultural Business Drought Grant Program. It's the first ever grant program that I'm aware of its kind that focuses on ag businesses, not the farmer, but the businesses that the farmers rely on. Help us keep those long-tenured employees, right? Help us have those businesses to go back to. It was happened as a direct result of a significant effort by Secretary Ross. Thank you. It's a $75 million grant program focused on the Central Valley, those areas impacted by drought, and provides some very modest grants to these businesses, so hopefully they can make it through to a next year. Good news for this board is it looks like as the legislature and the administration work on what they agree on, this is one of those things, right? So this should be in the first round of budget agreements, and we're excited about that. We are working with the legislature and the administration and have been for a number of months now. We hope to get a few tweaks in that program to make it the most effective possible for those businesses that I discussed. We're also working with a collaboration of ag organizations in the state on the federal side for some more substantive relief for, again, those businesses that are not covered by crop insurance. The Employee Retention Tax Credit Program was a COVID program. We do have some hope and some belief that we'll be able to work that through Congress, a program that actually pays employers, right, a refund of some of your federal taxes for retaining those key employees. We're also working to see if we can't secure some USDA grant funds that might be able to come back to California, Sacramento Valley, other areas most significantly impacted by drought. Long term, my rice mills would very much also like to have a crop insurance type of program, right? It was easy for a grower, if a drought can be easy, to understand what the next steps are. They were going to be able to go and talk to USDA and find out, how crop insurance was going to work on their land this year. A rice dryer, certainly an aerial applicator, can't do that. So I just close my comments by reflecting to you a number of times I've heard this comment from my industry, mostly from the ag supplier sector, is that they've never seen a year like this, and indeed we haven't. I would just note that we at the Commission really feel like our job, and we appreciate our partners, is that our response must be equal to that challenge. So thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you, Chairman Cameron and Secretary Ross, for having me here today. My name is Frank Muller. I'm a farmer in Yolo County, but I also have the pleasure of serving as the chairman of the board of Pacific Coast Producers, a cooperative processing company with operations in California, Oregon, and Washington State. And so I kind of have a little bit of perspective as a processor also, and it allows me maybe a unique spot here. I'm representing the tomato industry. Mike Motna, our head of our Tomato Growers Association, couldn't be here today. He's on vacation, and I was asked to step in for him. I did borrow some of his slides, so I give him credit for that. California Tomato Growers Association is a bargaining association that represents the majority of the growers, the tomato growers in California, and bargains for a price directly with the processors. And they're kind of an information holder for our industry. Josh, if you could turn the slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our industry to give you a little bit of a background, and this is tough to follow, Tim, because the drought hits industries very, very differently in agriculture, and certainly the rice is one of the most compelling industry stories that we have, how the drought has affected it, but the processing tomato industry has proven to be very resilient for a number of different reasons that I'll share, but I'll give you some of the statistics here, and I wish I could see that a little bit better. But if you look at this is the estimated acreage in California this year, and the red line is on the right-hand side is what we're expecting this year. And if you can see, it's very similar to the last few years. The National Agricultural Statistics Service is the one that provided the information for the red line. I think the acreage is 235,000 acres, but the industry, including the association, thinks it's going to be somewhere around 225,000 acres, which will put it very much on par with last year. Josh, next slide. So here's our tonnage trends, and again, the NASS is predicting a crop size of about 11.7 million tons. The number of acres times the tons per acre is what determines that. The industry feels it's going to be a little bit less than that because the NASS is using a 50-ton, and Josh, you could turn this again, is using a 50-ton per acre average, and the association is using a 48-ton per acre average. A 50-ton per acre average would be the second highest on history, and given all of the problems we've had already in California, people feel that's a little bit excessive. So, Josh, next slide, please. The underlying factor here is that we are not going to be able to produce enough tomatoes in California, however, to keep our ending inventories of where we'd like. This is for the period ending June 1st, 2022, and if you look at the beginning number of 3.4 million tons versus 2.6, we're eating into our inventories, and with the crop size projected by the association this year, our inventory levels should even drop further than that, which are historic lows. That is a concern as we move forward because the industry is just not capable of keeping up with demand. Josh, next slide. The good news there, see here we have the trend line. The green line is the one I'm looking at. Ending inventories are going down. California produces 96% of the U.S.'s tomato supply and roughly 32% of the world's tomato supplies. And for all of you who don't know, this processing tomatoes are the ones that are used for sauces, paste, whole peeled tomatoes, ketchup, all of those kind of products. Josh, next slide. We will not go, our shelves will not go dry in the United States if the crop size is decreasing because there's still a robust export market. Has been declining. It's mostly related to the strength of the dollar. But if product gets short in the United States, the export market is going to be the one that will be cut off first to supply the domestic market. Josh, next slide. So here is the world crop, and again, the factors there, there's a drought in Italy, a little bit of a drought in Spain. Ukraine produces about 800,000 metric tons, and that supply is very much in question this year if they're even going to produce a crop. But you can see the trend lines are going down for the world supply. So the question is, how does this happen? The rice industry is losing half of their production. How does this happen that we can maintain these acres of tomatoes throughout California? And there's a number of reasons. The processors do not, they have multi-million dollar facilities. They do not want their facilities to go to run at less than full capacity for the season. So they're willing to look around the state, and if they have to haul tomatoes from different areas, they're willing to do that. The line for the processor is that if they don't get enough production, that they have a huge overhead costs. And if they're not able to get the production that they want and run their plants at capacity, the overhead costs that they spread for the rest of the product they produce will put them in an uncompetitive position. So they will do anything they can to fill their facilities. The row crop ground, the ground that tomatoes are grown on, traditionally has more versatility to it, more diversity. Rice ground tends to be heavier ground, is really good for rice. It's not very porous, and so the water that you use to flood the rice will stay on the ground. Where row crop ground is a finer textured and has more diversity. So our bargaining association, the Tomato Growers Association, this year allowed bargain for an early price when we had all the rain in the fall. Input prices started increasing. They were able to achieve a price in early December that was about 25% higher than the previous year's price. Now, in hindsight, it doesn't seem like it's enough because right after they signed the price, it stopped raining and our input costs just skyrocketed. So some people think it should even be higher, but if you're looking at food costs as we go on, this hasn't even hit the marketplace yet, and that's the same thing with a lot of these commodities. The stuff that's producing now when it hits the marketplace is going to be more expensive. So expect more inflation. Every grower is faced with different water issues. If I look at my surrounding area, I'm in Yolo County, California, and if you drive around my area, you really don't see a lot of the impact of the drought. The water in Yolo County comes from the Sacramento River, comes through the Tamacalusa Canal, comes through the Yolo County Flood Control District that gets water from Clear Lake and Indian Valley. But we also have a lot of groundwater. We have arguably one of the more sustainable groundwater supplies in California. So in my immediate area, it's the sun's shining and the birds are singing. But if I just venture out, 5 miles either way, you can really see these areas that don't rely on groundwater. They're much more severely impacted. Growers have made a tremendous investment in drip irrigation and irrigation technology, and that's really helped our industry. I've had studies done on my farm through UC Davis and the Natural Resource Conservation Service that we've documented a 40% reduction in water use by using drip irrigation. So that's allowed us to farm more acres and spread our water farther. The biggest issue we had this year is because it stopped raining in December, when we got to our fields in the springtime to plant, we had to put the water in the ground that normally would have been supplied by the spring rains that weren't there. So our water use is actually a little bit higher this year than it has been historically because we had to replenish the water that didn't come in the early winter months. We also have our crop is contracted. No one's going to plant tomatoes in California without a contract in hand. We have long-term relationships with our processors, and it's important to maintain these relationships. So by having an early price that's 25% higher than the previous year and having other crops that didn't respond to the cost increases of the drought made tomatoes a very attractive alternative compared to other crops. We also start putting transplants in our greenhouses in early January. So once you start buying seed and putting plants in the greenhouse, you're committed to it. So on my own farm, it's like, how do I irrigate with less water? So what we did is we prioritize, and I think most farmers, every farmer does this, you prioritize where you're the biggest bang for your buck with per drop of water. You grow crops that are going to give you the highest returns, and tomatoes were right up there. This is the most competitive I've ever seen the contracting of all crops this year. We had processors coming from all over the state into Yolo County looking for acres that they weren't able to achieve other places. So anytime that happens, that's the best word a farmer could ever use. No is a really good word to tell these guys, I will not do this unless you raise your price. And it's not very often that farmers have the ability to do that, but this year it worked. So the tomato industry has its issues. It's thriving. We're going to get our acres this year. We will get our pack, but it's kind of a testament to the resilience of agriculture, to diversity. And there's no doubt that this drought has hit every commodity and every grower differently throughout the state. And certainly, Tim, your comments about labor and some of the suppliers is very much appropriate, even in our area. Fortunately, with some of the tomato growers, we're able to pick up some of that labor that these guys aren't finding in other places. So the abundance of labor is much greater this year. And I think there are certain parts of the industry that are picking up some of those, the unemployed people are just moving to different areas. So that's about all I have. I would entertain questions, and I appreciate you being here today.
Really, thank you both for your excellent presentations. Really appreciate you both coming in today. You go right ahead.
A specific
Secretary.
question to Frank, and it's only because I've talked to Tim so frequently, but I do, again, want to acknowledge Undersecretary Birdsong's work on that grant program, too. So we want to continue working with you, Tim, and also want to work with you to get some USDA officials out here. I think that'll be important soon. But Frank, I have a question for you because Nancy mentioned it, and we're starting to talk about it a lot. Carla Namath has really coined it well, as she does on all things water, and that is this drought has shown us we have another user of water, and it is the atmosphere because of the ever-increasing temperatures, the ambient air temperatures. And so you noted this year that after nothing happening after December as far as precipitation, you had to do some earlier season watering. And I'm wondering, is this something that we hope it'll just be a periodic thing, except that in the last 10 years, we've had about 7 years of drought. Are you starting to look at that as something else to factor into your water budget, or am I just getting too far out there with this kind of temperature change and what it could be bringing us?
It's always hard for me to factor in things like that I would rather have us get back to normal and this, I don't believe where we are is the new normal. It's just we've had some very strange years the last couple of years. And I know one of the first years I started farming, some of my colleagues that were about my age, we were kind of lamenting the fact that the weather was so weird. And this was a number of years ago, and an old timer said, no 2 years are alike in agriculture. And that's kind of what makes it interesting and makes it challenging at the same time, and sometimes not very good. But it's hard to answer that. But that those dry springs are really, really tough. And I'd rather, if I could have my perfect rainfall, I'd like to have it spread out kind of all over. But we just, we had maybe 70% of our normal rainfall this year, but it just all came at the one time, and it wasn't very useful because there was too much water. But the good part of that is it made all of our creeks and rivers and flow and our sloughs, and that really helped with our groundwater recharge. So our starting point with our groundwater this year was not much different from last year, just because of that wet period we have. So there's a challenge if you only get a little bit of rain and don't have any runoff. That's a really bad one too. So you want to have, big events and then kind of meter out. But it's every year's so different, Karen. It's hard to say.
Bryce, and then Patricia.
Thank you for your presentations. Question is for Tim. Tim, I was just wondering, does rice use more water than other crops? And
I think I've known you
why are water districts like Glen Calusa, RD 108, Sutter Mutual, Meridian Irrigation, Anderson Cottonwood, Princeton Provident, and Natomas Mutual, who have senior water rights that by contract cannot be cut more than 25%, many getting zero water this year?
Great questions, Bryce. Thank you. So first question is, does rice use a lot of water? You'll hear that sometimes. You ignore that, and then that whole person. You can just ignore that whole person. In fact, rice does not use a lot of water. We use about the same amount of water as measured by evapotranspiration, which is about the fair way to do it, as most other row crops, right? Tomatoes actually use less water because they're drip irrigated. We also have saved water over the years. We use about 30% less water than we did 3 decades ago. We do that by using GPS systems to perfectly level that field. So if you want 5 inches of water applied to the field, it's 5 inches across the whole field. We also used to have rice plants that were about 6 feet tall. Now we have rice plants that are about 3 feet tall, 3.5 feet, and they just use less water. We did that through conventional breeding. So every crop, right, has the things that it can can do, and then certainly I don't know anybody that's just like, whatever, it's just like the way it was when my grandfather farmed, and I can turn out as much water out of the river as possible. Everybody's just a little different. I can't really use drip tape in a rice field. It just doesn't make sense. Why is the Sacramento River so impacted? I'll use a comment from Charlie Hoppin, one of our growers, former chair of the State Water Board. He said, don't be mad at the State Water Board. Don't even be mad at the Department of Water Resources. If you're going to be mad at God, right? Because it just did not rain in the Shasta Watershed. And the Shasta Watershed is a rain-driven reservoir. It doesn't get a lot of snow, so we're not waiting for runoff that would come in the springtime. And because there's so little water in the Sacramento River, even the most senior water rights, as Bryce had mentioned, you're never supposed to get, by contract, less than 75% of the water that would have been there, right, even before they put in Shasta Reservoir, right, those old water rights. That just shows you how important it is where the rain falls, right? Not only when, but where. And in fact, rice typically is seen as a crop that provides water to others, right? That we can fallow our field, you can't fallow an orchard. We can fallow our field and plant some tomatoes because the prices are very high. That kind of stinks, and it's a little hard in average years. It was so bad this year, we didn't do much of that, if any, actually, I believe, right? And so everybody who relies on the Sacramento River got far less water than they would have otherwise, just because it didn't rain between Redding and the Oregon border. And so that's why this drought in the Sacramento River basin is so bad. The other thing is, we never really had to go out and develop groundwater, which for the layperson means you didn't go out and put wells in, right? We have water tables in the Sacramento Valley that are well under 50 feet, 50. We could go out and develop those groundwater resources. I expect over time that may be a more useful tool for our farmers, but we've not had to do that. So we didn't have anything really to fall back on.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I have a question for the Tomato Growers Association, and following kind of like the statement and comment that Secretary Ross made about climate change and alternatives to growing tomatoes. I lived in Arizona for 20 years, and the only tomatoes that are grown there is in a greenhouse. So are there any plans for the California Tomato Growers Association to start developing greenhouse capacity and thus protect water use and head towards climate change? And
so there are, my slide showed 235,000 acres of tomatoes grown in California. So I'm not aware of any effort that the Tomato Growers Association is undertaking, but I know there's some research being done by processors that are looking at year-round greenhouses that would grow tomatoes year-round and feed them into the processing plant on a continuous basis. But that's very energy-driven to heat the greenhouses in the wintertime and maybe a little more labor-intensive. All of our tomatoes are harvested by machines, very mechanized industry. So, but if you had a year-round plant like that, it wouldn't have to be as large, and by running it year-round, you wouldn't have the issues, like I said, with overhead, spreading overheads, because you're running it like any other factory that you would. So I know there is some research being done there, and how far along that is, I don't know, but
yeah, I think this is one of the situations where, states need to collaborate with each other. Arizona, given the climate conditions there, they are, of course, ahead of the game. I have seen 12 feet rows of tomatoes for acres and acres, and that I'm pretty sure it's may become very comparable to the acreage that is farmed here. So I would be interesting to join efforts and start looking at data, comparing data, and then seeing the pros and cons of.
And most of
both.
those tomatoes are pretty much all of them are used for fresh market for the grocery stores, where ours are processing. And those are the ones you see, the
That's
ones
the
I grow, the ones
difference.
going down the road with 25 tons at a time and bouncing on your windshield, as
Yeah.
Karen said, right?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Use that there. All right, so I'm curious. I was interested in your response in terms of whether or not tomato growers were thinking of this as a short or long-term problem, like the current conditions. And I wanted to actually put that same question to the rice growers. Like, what do rice growers see? Rice growers who are in drought-impacted areas, do they think of this as a long-term or short-term problem? What's the future of rice growing in those regions?
I would say yes and no. I mean, I think, much like the stock market, right? It's way more volatile than it was before, right, Frank? The weather seems these last number of years to be far more volatile. But really a farmer, especially of an annual crop, you look at it on an annual basis and you make your decisions. I think most of us would realize that there's something going on in the climate we need to be able to manage too. It's really hard to understand what that might look like and how that might be. I think, as Frank had mentioned, we very much look forward to a better year next year. If you sit next to Bryce Lundberg, what's he always say? Oh, next year, right? It's going to be better next year. Every farmer I know says that, right? Next year will be better. Doesn't mean I think that we don't believe that climate change is real and all of those things. And we've got folks all over the spectrum. The question becomes, how can you manage that? What can you do, right? And so I think in the academic world, I think it's sort of just in general society, there's this belief that you can go to the shelf and take off the climate change book and change your crop. So it takes an average of about 7 years to breed a new rice variety, right? So and then that's a crop, right, that you can grow 2 rotations in a year. You do it here, and then maybe you move to Hawaii, right? So you can go 2 plant generations in a year. And still takes us 7 years to get one that we can plant, commercially. So it's a very difficult. In fact, some of the literature tells us that as climate change increases, we may actually see higher levels of productivity out of the varieties that we do grow. So we're constantly looking at the factors that we can change, but the ability to make modifications is a slow process, even in an annual crop.
Can I ask one follow-up thing really quickly? If folks don't believe it's a long-term problem, how do you make those kinds of plans to develop something that takes 7 years or to invest in groundwater?
There's so much beyond the control of a farmer, right? And so I'm not going to be political here, but I'm going to talk about a political statement, right? And so is it a farmer's responsibility to go out and develop more surface water, to develop a regulatory system that goes out and does a better job at allocating groundwater? No, but we're the recipient of that, right? And so we're trying to farm an acre of rice in Colusa County. You're focused on farming that acre of rice. You're focused on the things that you can impact. You send folks like me to go talk to hearings, like at the Water Commission, and go talk to the legislature, et cetera. But in all honesty, I think the state of California is behind what to do about climate change, right? So my complaint is that we spend time talking about how do we reverse change, how do we get around the whatever number of degrees and whatever. Awesome. So we have to live that long, right, to be able to see the benefits of that. There's less work, my opinion, on sort of how do we adapt now? How do we manage what we have now to a better end? That's where a farmer lives every single season. God help you if you've got an orchard, right? I cannot grow rice because we don't have water on the Sacramento River. Not growing an orchard is a different discussion. And so I think agriculture needs both, right? Certainly we need to address these long-term impacts, but there has to be a real clear recognition that there needs to be interim steps, right? That help farmers manage, use the resources that we have now. And that, from a production agriculture perspective, is the thing I think that oftentimes isn't always thought about, right? I'll be polite. Isn't always thought about. We're off talking about greenhouse gas reductions, but we're not talking about what do I do, right? Where's Sites Reservoir? What about this other thing, right? That's the stuff that we've got to be able to do and get right so that we can live for 30 years, right? Our kids can come back, right, when we've addressed climate change on a more comprehensive basis. The people that will help us do that are folks like the University of California, right? People that help do applied research, right? When a grower says, what do I do if I don't have enough water to finish my rice crop? The answer is going to come from Glenda's shop, right? That's where it's going to come from.
If I could add to that just briefly without even being asked. So water, we're here talking about drought, but there's so many variables that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And, on my big concern most days is the price of everything I'm paying for. So, farmers are really committed to putting food on the shelf but there are a number of different variables, in the drought and the climate change are certainly one of those variables, but we just find ways to adapt and make changes. And with climate change coming over time, we're already making adaptations to climate change with different varieties of selecting. I grow 30 different varieties of tomatoes, and in dry years, some varieties do better, and those are the ones we're gravitating toward. Without the breeders even knowing they're breeding them for drought, the growers are finding these are better in dry years. So there's all these changes we make every day, all year long, to adjust to these different variables. And drought is certainly a significant one, but it's not the only one.
Well, Josh, can you check online, and anyone in the audience who would like to make a public comment on this agenda item, you can step on up.
For those online, if you would like to make public comment on this agenda item, please use your hand icon and I will unmute your line. Anastasia Allen, your line is unmuted.
Hello, board. I would like to take a minute and just thank you and thank Tim Johnson for coming in. I'm Anastasia Allen. I'm the Agricultural Commissioner of Colusa County, and I would just like to just reinforce and reiterate some of the things that these gentlemen have said today. Seeing what is going on firsthand here in Colusa County, going from an average of 150,000 acres of rice that we do yearly to seeing it drop year after year in the last few years to barely over 7,000 acres this year has been pretty devastating. Everything Tim is saying, it's not what if the aerial applicators go out, or what if the mills go out. What we're seeing and what we're feeling here in our community every day, I'm talking to growers who are concerned about the supplemental agencies, the supplemental businesses that help keep them farming year after year. We have aerial applicators deciding to close up. We have businesses that are very struggling, and we have a migrant farm housing, the third largest in the state, that's full of people really wanting to work and that come here every day to work. So it is pretty devastating seeing the effects of the, like Tim said, the unequal allocation of water. Yeah, you go across the county lines and things are very much different. And it does feel like we're on a little island of our own here. So these resources that your board and Secretary Ross, I've had an opportunity to talk to her about, and I'd like to just personally thank everyone for their efforts and know that it is much welcomed. I talk to growers and trucking companies and applicators, custom applicators every day that are looking for this little lifeline of bridge. And we do hope to come back. But like what was kind of inferred, if the businesses aren't there to support 150,000 acres of rice next year, I'm not sure what our community will do. Growers are resilient. We'll find a way around. Just like Frank said, we'll adapt. But I'd just like to take a minute and thank everyone for their time and effort here.
Thank you. I'm seeing no further public comment at this time.
Thank you, Josh. Tim and Frank, great having you here. Really appreciate you coming in today and giving us the boots on the ground view of what's going on in your area. So thank you both. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and we will reconvene at 1 o'clock.
I mean, it just goes to show you how different it is. You think you know, but you don't know. We don't. Not even very many of my farmers grow tomatoes, right? A few do, but.
But it's just, it's really a interesting dynamic, you know, that there's, everybody's just jockeying for the water. You know,
It is,
for
sure.
Yeah, they're just, my door's been beaten down like I've never seen before.
Right.
People from all over the state. Right. And so.